This talk really is brand new. I created it for this event, and it forced me to look back over the past 25 years to discover how I got sort of where I am today. This is an important person for academics. This is someone who decides how research money gets spent. These are one of the people that they survey the research landscape. They look over it, and certainly for applied areas like building science, they want to spot gaps where they exist, and then they wonder, how can we fill this research gap? There's an idea. That looks about right. Okay. So what can we do? We need some method of encouragement. There's the method. And so we've put out a funding call through the usual channels and so forth. And as soon as that appears, academics quickly come around it. The fortunate ones who put in a bid and are selected, they will go off and do the research. Off they go. Oh, not forgetting. Most important, take that with them. And everyone gets together, sometimes later, and ideally they assess the work. Has this gap been filled? That's it. Ooh, look. Yay! Isn't that great? A research gap's been filled. Immediately the world changes. Practitioners do everything differently. Maybe even building code, statutory things, they change. So we can call that method the idealist rational one. Probably doesn't happen as often as we'd like, and certainly not as often as perhaps the research councils would like, because often this is part of their mission statement. They'll say how they engage with practice and so forth, and things change. There's also the idealist romantic one. Here the work's been done, everything's been done, everybody knows what's what, but nobody's listening. You're in the same room, nobody's listening to you about your good idea. You're at the end of your tether. You may want to imagine that you're Jimmy Stewart at this role in a Frank Capra movie, and just when it looks like that's it, it's hopeless, oh no, you've caught somebody's ear, and then everything's fine at the end. And as with the previous previous method, everything changes. But why doesn't that happen as often? Well, in the second one, it only happens in the movies. And in the first one, it doesn't happen as often as we'd like, because the world is a lot more complicated than certainly researchers imagine, certainly when I imagined when I began many years ago. And part of that is the route from research to practice is not at all clear. Right. And it's not just the route, but there'll be key players along that route, so-called gatekeepers, the ones that you have to really, those are the hearts and minds that you have to win over. And you probably don't know who they are or where they are. But let's say you come across one. And you have an answer. You have the answer ready. It could be a new daylight metric or something like that. You have the answer, and you're there with the gatekeeper. But the answer that you have, it might not be to the questions that they're asking. So, sorry, translators, you'll have to do your best with that one. And anyone under 50, just go and see the movie. So, in the real world, this is the sort of MacGuffin for this talk, the parable of the tortoise and the gorilla. But actually not that sort, this sort. Undergraduate bad hair day, lasted about 1,000 days, actually. In fact, I did my first Illumination modeling back then in a very different context. So why gorilla? Tortoise, well, moves slowly, of course. So gorilla is times when you need to do things a little bit differently. And that means sort of thinking on your feet very quickly. You're presented with a circumstance that you hadn't anticipated. So we'll look at some examples and what happens. So first one, the Education Funding Agency. This was a big deal in 2013 when climate-based daylight modeling became a mandatory requirement. So this was a game changer. Up till then, The metrics, of course, have been based on something like the daylight factor. So this was the first time anywhere in the world that CBDM became a mandatory requirement. Now, just to give a little background to that, a bit earlier in the year 2000, the pitiful state of our school building stock became too difficult to ignore, even for the governments of the day. And so a building program called Building Schools for the Future was initiated, and this is going to be many tens of billions of pounds spent on schools. Now, the first wave of schools that came out were hugely slated for poor quality, often overheating for a number of reasons, poor ventilation, but also actually very poor glazing as well. The Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, a government body, were particularly scathing about this, where they said like 80% of them were poor. So, I mean, the government could not ignore sort of criticism like that, so they swung into action, and within a few years, that committee was disbanded. But why were we having these problems? Perhaps it was something like this, perhaps because the message about daylight was getting across, but it was being poorly implemented. That's a quote from a Building Schools for the Future document. It said, "Maximize daylight factor to improve student performance." Now, the message about good daylight was getting across, but when you only have the daylight factor, then the answer becomes higher daylight factors, in which case the school ultimately would tend to a sort of botanical garden design or something like that, with very high daylight factors. So hardly surprising we had poor designs, and indeed we still have those schools, and children are still fainting in temperatures of low 30s indoors in the in the UK, which is hardly the equator. So climate-based diet modelling had been around as an idea for a while. So this was predicting daylight using realistic sun and sky conditions. It's a little history. It goes, earliest glimmerings were about 1995. The useful daylight illuminance metric, about 10 years later, 2005. The first school that I did, possibly the first school that had been evaluated using CBDM, was in 2008. The Education Funding Agency decision was 2013. And I think of those as the wilderness years back then, because not a lot seemed to be happening. I was in the sort of Jimmy Stewart role, saying, here's a good idea, but not a lot of interest. But things actually were happening. Now I look back, there were presentations on the technique to the CIBSE symposia in the UK, so that's the Chartered Institute of Building Surveying Engineers, one of our main sort of professional bodies like the UK ASHRAE, if you will. A little bit with the CIE, but with my CIE hat on, I'd say we're not as well connected as we could be, I think, CIE. British Standards Institute, a revision of daylight standard came out in 2008. I helped on that. And the real difference in that standard compared to the previous revision was a technical annex on climate-based daylight modelling. So this wasn't an out-and-out recommendation, but it was a tacit one, for sure. So the school also in 2008, this was a local architects in Loughborough, in the Midlands, near us. And probably one of the most important factors was actually the daylight group. And it's a pleasure to see the secretary of the daylight group here, David McNair at the back there. So the daylight group is a special interest group run by CIBSE. And there was lots of presentations around then and lots of vigorous discussion about new techniques and metrics and so forth and applications. And importantly, it was people from industry were attending those as well, from Arups, Cundall, and so forth. And also around this time, tools like Diva for Rhino were coming out, and that sort of hugely broadened the user base for climate-based light modeling. You didn't have to go in and into the Unix version and get stuck into that. So a lot was actually happening in those sort of wilderness years and later on. And this is what really led to those changes, because it was actually people who'd been attending the daylight group meetings and so forth, they were feeding back advice and guidance to the Education Funding Agency. Now, when things change, be prepared for a reaction. And in fact, if you don't get one, it's probably not very big impact. So this was a big deal. An article appeared like this. And so this is saying, absolutely no, it's absolutely appalling. And it's perfectly proper. It's perfectly proper to come out with things like that. Yeah? Now, when things change, so they need to be addressed and so forth. And in fact, as academics, I think we don't do enough of this because we often have disagreements. And more, I think we should see correspondence in the professional journals and so forth about these. So I wrote a paper called Climate-Based Site Modeling and its discontents addressing these. And of course, it's one of the many hundreds and hundreds of papers and books which have pinched Freud's original title of Civilization and its Discontents. Nordstrom Tower. So 2018, this should be finished next year. It'll be the world's tallest residential building. This might be surprising. It still surprises me, actually. I have to pinch myself. The legal agreement for the development includes a measure of daylight injury to an adjacent building predicted using CBDM. So here's the building, the Art Student League, 1875. The Nordstrom Tower will be going next door there. And on the top, they have these daylit studio spaces. These are highly valued by the the artists and users of that space. So they were concerned about the impact of that building. Look at the timeline for this. 3D San Francisco, 2000. The first Art Student League study, 2005. The second one, 2013, and the building will be completed then. So this was, that image there is an irradiation map of the cumulative annual irradiation falling on all the building surfaces for San Francisco. That was the most complex 3D city model I could find at the time. About 3 years later, I noticed things had moved on enormously, and there were these fantastically complex 3D models of Manhattan. So I got in touch with the people who owned this model and licensed it and said, can I have it, please, just a stress test my technique to show that it will work with 1 million polygons, not just a few thousand. They came back with a very polite but firm no. And then in 2005, they became advisors for the users of the building, the Art Student League, who were concerned about the daylight injury. They remembered my conversation with them, my cold calling, 2 years before, and got back to me and said, the users are not happy with what they've been offered. They found it abstract, like the daylight factor and so forth. What could you offer them? Well, I said, well, how about total annual illumination? Pitch it like this. If you leave a light meter on the window for a whole year and you add up the illuminance every hour for that whole year, you get a total. You do the same with the building in place. If it goes down by 30%, that means you're going to get 30% less light into your space. And that was something tangible for them. So they wanted that. The other amazing thing that happened was that the developers actually agreed to it. Now, this was back in 2005. Not many people were really thinking about CBDM at that time. So in terms of impact, oh, sorry, I should say then also in 2000 and, oh, where are we? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, in the project got put on hold because of the financial crash, and then the revised design came out in 2013, and it had to be evaluated again to show that it was no worse than what had been agreed in the first place. Yeah. Now, the whole business of rights to light in urban settings is a hot topic, and in the UK, the Law Commission ran an advisory review of rights to light and so forth, and this figured in that review. Also, I believe the developers of 22 Bishopsgate, which is going to be a very tall building in London, are aware of this. So it's getting out there. But it's not all just big. This is the final design for the Nordstrom Tower. And this is the only other example where I think it's been used in climate, where CBDM has been used in a planning application, certainly that I'm aware of. And this is a residential dwelling in Long Sutton, Somerset. From the big to the very small, and the surveyor was really cross that the design had been refused, and he picked up my name from the BSI annex and got to me and said, what can you do? And I said, well, we can do the same thing we did for the Nordstrom Tower. We did. It didn't get passed for another reason, but importantly, baby steps, but importantly, the local authority didn't contest the methodology or the conclusions reached from that. So we just need one judge, I think, in the UK to look at, say, a rights to light and compare the existing methodology, which is nearly 100 years old, to the new approach. And if they decide that the new approach makes sense, then that changes everything. Nearly there. National trust. Paintings, you need to protect them from light. You need light to see them. You need to protect them as well. So same for fabrics and so forth. So the first project we did at the National Trust was an evaluation of this painting, the Hambletonian, by Stubbs. It's there under that huge light, roof light and cupola. Yeah, I'll be a little wet. So we did simulations, total annual illumination, and saw that the painting was getting much more light than it should. And we looked at interventions, reducing the cupola reflectance, reducing the transmittance of the roof light. And indeed, those things were tried out in simulation and then enacted on the building. So it made a difference. But this began a longer project to look at light in spaces. Now, as Stefan mentioned about the invisible light, for conservation, what you want to see there is the invisible light. So you measure that with meters, but that's only 1 or 2 points in a space. What we want to see is the illumination that's falling onto it. You can do that easy with simulation, but with measurement, it's a little bit tricky. But we found a way with what's called high dynamic range imaging, where we can reconstruct the illumination field now. This is just at one instant, but we leave the camera running for months and months and months. And the Trust made a nice video about this, about how it's affecting their decisions they're making about light management guides for their properties. Very quickly, accelerate New York Times. That was a big project. This was back in 2005. That was the detail of the model that we used. Incredible effort went into this. Lots of cool stuff was done, real seat of the pants evaluation. We didn't call it human-centric lighting back then, but we were looking at luminance metrics and so forth. Massive amount of data was produced, 140 gigabytes. Produced, but you also need to understand all of that data. Or at least a good part of it, the stuff that makes sense. So this, I believe, is the processor that I had in my twin-core desktop. But actually, this is the rate-limiting step. You have to think with this processor about everything that drops out of your simulations, because there is huge complexity in all of this. And as soon as you start going to sort of multi-dimensional metrics, it's not just illuminance on the horizontal. I'm really just beginning to understand, I think, that for climate-based, but when you've got other directional dependent things and so forth. And until simulations become, evaluations become absolutely routine, you do need to depend on that soft processor on the right there, not just the one in your computer. Nearly there. There is a big issue about reproducibility. There's been a lot in the press recently about study. We find it difficult to reproduce studies. It might be because we've got small numbers in our subjects, or it might be because things are incredibly complex. And I think in lighting, we have a bit of both of that. That doesn't mean to say don't do work with small studies, definitely do, but constantly revisit and try and replicate results, because when you've got very complex things going on, it might not be easy to come to a simple goal and outcome. I think we're discovering that. And I certainly can't say anything about his hair, not from where I'm standing. So what are the take-home messages? I think they are about engagement, long-term engagement with professional bodies, in particular CIBSE for us, but companies as well, to do real-world research wherever possible. And also to make that part of the culture of the institution. So this is one of my PhD students who's nearly finished. And even before she's finished her PhD, she's just been elected to be a member of the CIBSE Council. This is Eleonora Brembila. And I've put that box there to remind me of the engagement with ARUP, because her PhD was an industry case award on the applicability of climate-based daylight modelling. So there's that industry link right from the beginning of her project. So I've overrun, my apologies for that, but thank you very much for listening.